Thank you very much for coming to this very special start of our Open Baptist weekend and this open lecture at the beginning of it. It is just wonderful to see all the connections, people who have known each other for a long time, people who have just known each other on Zoom and are discovering how high each other are, and people who are meeting new friends for the first time. Connections are really very important. And so we wanted to invite Selena to come and do a welcome to country because we've had a connection with your family for a while now. Auntie Agnes Shea did her first welcome to country in this church and passed away, sadly, 7 months ago. But her daughter Annette is here to support now Selena as she continues doing welcomes to country, just as she supported Auntie Agnes, her mum. So thank you, Selena.
Thank you. Yuma, Kalaganya Jolena Woga, Darawanona Darawanona. Hello, my name is Selena Walker, and this is Ngunnawal Country. I'd like to first start by acknowledging my elders, the Ngunnawal elders, and pay respect to my elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge my beautiful Auntie Annette, who is the daughter, as mentioned, of Auntie Agnes Shea. I want to acknowledge the recent passing of my grandmother, Auntie Agnes Shea, who was the most senior Ngunnawal elder here. I want to acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are with us here this evening. Welcome my brothers, sisters, aunts and uncles. And I'd like to extend that to all of our non-Indigenous friends that have joined us. Welcome. The Ngunnawal community are the traditional custodians of Canberra and the region. You may not be aware that the Ngunnawal nation is made up of several family groups and not just individuals who represent this country. Therefore, as a community, we have an elected body known as the United Ngunnawal Elders Council to represent us, along with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body of the ACT. This is important for you to understand and acknowledge, for our identity is a collective identity. There are other Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from around the nation, the country and the world who've come to live on Ngunnawal land. I would like to acknowledge and welcome you all. The tradition of welcoming the people to country is a practice that was handed down by our ancestors, old people and elders from the beginning of time. Before entering another person's country, you would first announce your arrival and not enter until a traditional owner formally welcomed you. The reason for this practice was to protect your spirit while in another person's country and also to show respect for the country which you were entering. It's wonderful to see that this practice is now recognised and respected. I suppose it's not like entering into someone's home unless you're first invited. The Ngunnawal people, as within all Aboriginal people, have a great heritage that would like to share with all Australians from every walk of life. As you are aware, Canberra means meeting place, and Canberra has been a place of gathering for many Aboriginal tribes of Australia to come together to deal with important business and also for ceremonial purposes. Our Ngunnawal ancestors believed in the importance of people gathering to build relationships, share knowledge and to celebrate the gift of heritage and history. We believe it's important for all to recognise our unique history and to get an understanding that our land is our heritage and how loss of the land has disconnected so many Aboriginal people from their spiritual links, cultural heritage and identity. Reconciliation is not just a word, it's an action, and it's a human rights movement. As an Aboriginal person in this country, I've only been counted as a human being for 56 years. Let me repeat that while that sinks in. I, as a beautiful black person in Australia, have only been counted as a human being for 56 years. I'm only 42. We are very young in our reconciliation journey here in Australia, but we're on the right path. By incorporating proper cultural protocols like welcome to country, smoking ceremonies, etc., we are on the road to true reconciliation. It does hurt me though that my dad was born a tree, that my grandmother was a mother before she was a human being. So I ask you all to take a moment and think about how old you are, how old your children are, and how old your elders are, and what you're doing to contribute to that reconciliation human rights movement. The referendum that just went through was another milestone in our reconciliation journey. Not the result that we wanted, but it did uncover a lot of truths. It also helped to highlight where the work of reconciliation needs to be focused and where we need to channel our efforts across the nation, but also here, locally as well. I am very proud of my fellow Canberrans, being the only state that got the yes vote. So we should all be proud of that. And moving forward, we need to still have those uncomfortable conversations for the future of reconciliation here in Australia, for better outcomes for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So thank you once again for inviting me here to do the Welcome to Country. I unfortunately can't stay for the rest of the event. I have left 3 teenage boys at home, so it's probably state of origin in my living room right now, so go Queensland. But thank you once again for inviting me here. It's great to see that this is in practice, and well done to the work that you do and to the organisers. And I'll now finish in the words of my people, the Ngunnawal people. Yumalandi Yunanga Yerabu Yangu, which means you may leave footprints on our land now. Or in other words, welcome to country. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Nathan Nettleton, and I'm part of the initial board of the Open Baptists and one of the organisers of this weekend's event. I'm a pastor from Melbourne, a member of one of the Baptist World Alliance study commissions, and my academic work has been in the areas of liturgical studies, that very traditional Baptist focus, you'll understand, and Baptist identity, to see if those two could mesh in any way. And I'm delighted to see you all here. This is the only session of this weekend's program for which the content has already been prepared, which doesn't mean that the rest of the weekend will be a mess. It means that after tonight, we will be allowing the agenda and content to emerge organically from the questions, interests, and ideas that you've brought with you. I've experienced this way of working numerous times, and I can assure you that you'll find the method both effective and energising. Over the weekend, it will enable us to explore our big questions as we set out to establish a new, open and distinctly Baptist association. What do we hope it will look like? What do we hope it will be able to do? How do we hope we will go about it? And how are we going to make it happen? But tonight, to set the scene for that, our task is to remind ourselves what it means to be distinctly Baptist. And my task, before I introduce Carolyn Francis, who will take us much deeper into that, is to locate the conversation in relation to the particular issues that led us to launch this new Open Baptist group in the first place. To name the elephant in the room, if you like. Concerns that the patterns of association practiced in our existing state Baptist associations are becoming less distinctly Baptist have been at the heart of the conversations that have led us to this weekend. But the triggers for those concerns have been very different in different parts of the country. In Victoria, it was the decidedly unsexy topic of constitutional reform, with 2 rounds of changes to the Union Constitution, which have made us a more centrally controlled organisation. In New South Wales, ACT, it has been the much more headline-grabbing move to impose doctrinal conformity about marriage on our churches and at pastors, and to expel those who dissent. And when the concerned groups on either side of the Murray River began talking to each other, we discovered that there was actually a significant overlap in our concerns, despite what it sounds like there, because so much focused around questions of Baptist identity and the erosion of it. So there was quickly a sense of interstate solidarity, and since then we've been finding common ground with others in other parts of Australia and New Zealand as well. And it's a pity that none of the New Zealanders are here, but they have been involved in the ongoing meetings. But it's the imminent expulsion of churches from the New South Wales ACT Association that has given this some urgency, because while the rest of us have no intention or expectation of leaving our existing associations, our New South Wales ACT sisters and brothers will need this new group to not only provide a network of solidarity that it can be for all of us, but to provide the essential associational infrastructure that they're being cut off from. For example, the accreditation of pastors. And for obvious reasons, that means that support for same-sex marriage as the trigger issue for the expulsion is seen by many as the rallying point for this new group. But it turns out that it's not quite true. The development that was perhaps not foreseen in New South Wales has been the emergence of a group of churches and pastors who hold conservative views on marriage, but who are so appalled by the obviously un-Baptist nature of this purge that they too have said that they will not sign the required edicts of conformity, and so will accept expulsion alongside the original targets. If that's you, thank you for being here. This raises some extremely important issues for us as we look to our shared future, because there's no value or viable future in just becoming the same-sex marriage Baptists, even if we weren't already more diverse than that. Associations that form over a single issue soon find themselves irrelevant as the heat goes out of that issue, and then they often split just as tragically over the next hot potato issue because they didn't take the opportunity to work out what it means to live creatively with such diversity and recognise the gifts of God in the diversity. But what would be a very worthwhile mission for us and a great contribution to the wider Baptist family is for us to develop and model a lively pattern of distinctly Baptist fellowship that enables us to unite in love and cooperate in ministry across these often divisive lines. Just tolerating each other is not nearly enough. Some of you will remember how a decade ago, Tony Campolo and his wife Peggy participated in some very public debates about the place of LGBT plus people within the church, with the two of them taking opposite sides. And the most important gift in that was actually their modelling of the ability to disagree while remaining in a relationship of real love and unity. When that particular ministry was ended in 2015 by Tony's change of mind, I have never been more disappointed at somebody newly agreeing with me. But surely our calling here is to scale up what they demonstrated at the individual couple level to the level of an association of churches. A number of the well-known distinctives of our Baptist heritage are easily understood in isolation, but they create some tricky contested space when they're juxtaposed against each other. For example, our commitments to associationalism and to the autonomy of the local church pull in opposite directions. And that tension has certainly been in play in some of these recent developments. But what we have perhaps not often grasped well is that some of the greatest gifts of our heritage are not found in those poles, but in the contested space between them, in the creative tensions between them. I believe that Carolyn is going to help us recognise and navigate some of these gifts of our heritage, perhaps especially in relation to one of the questions that is already challenging us in this group, and that's around how do we identify and name the beliefs and practices we hold in common without simply setting up the terms for the next round of conform or expel. Back in 1997, the Victorian Baptist Union commissioned a task force, which I was part of, to explore various questions about homosexuality and our churches. On the night that the Assembly debated and approved its final report, one prominent pastor got to his feet to challenge one of its findings, the one that pointed out that since our congregations are autonomous and can appoint non-ordained pastors, our churches could appoint gay pastors if they wished. We need to challenge that. We need to change that, he asserted. We need to make sure that our churches cannot do that. Our then General Superintendent rose in reply and said, well, you can do that, but if you do, you will cease to be Baptist, and the exit door is just over there. Your call. I suspect that the lessons of that moment were too quickly forgotten, and that's part of why we're back here now, where we are. So what is it about being distinctly Baptist that made that statement true then, and that continues to make it true? What is it about being distinctly Baptist that can enable us to forge an identity that does not flee from the contested spaces, but equips us to live creatively and expectantly in them, and to welcome the gifts of God that emerge from them, uniting us in our following of Jesus and our service of the world he loves? So to guide us deeper into this precious heritage, it is a delight and an honour to welcome Carolyn Francis to our gathering tonight. Carolyn currently serves as lecturer in Baptist identity and Christian history at Whitley College in Melbourne. And her academic interests include Baptist history and theology, the emergence of religious dissent in Europe prior to and during the Reformation, and the history of spiritual practices. Prior to taking up this role 2 years ago, she spent 20 years as an ordained pastor in inner city Baptist churches in Melbourne, including significant ministries at St Kilda Baptist and at Collins Street Baptist in the CBD. And those roles have given her the opportunity to engage in a range of social and political as well as spiritual issues, including homelessness and housing, marriage equality and inclusion, mental health and wellbeing, domestic violence and women's safety, and the role of the arts in the city, which has been a big emphasis at Collins Street. Yeah. For fun, she sings in the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra Chorus, reads lots of books, barracks enthusiastically for the Western Bulldogs, and hangs out with her husband Carl, who she just reminded me they met in a class that I was tutoring at Whitley College. I hadn't actually realised that. And their two kids who are now 18 and 19. When Carolyn finishes, we're going to turn off the live stream. Sorry to those of you who are on the live stream, but for the Q&A time after that, we want a little bit more privacy for that. And when we get to the Q&A, just to show how techie we are, there will be a QR code up on the screen that will enable you to send your questions directly to Phil Waugh, because he's Mr. Techie, who will be putting the questions to Carolyn and to me if anybody wants to talk to me, but I think you'll probably be talking to Carolyn. But for now, will you please join me in expressing our delight at having her with us this weekend and welcome her to the stage. Thanks, Carolyn.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join you this evening and to speak with you. It's an honour. Thank you, Nathan, for that introduction, for highlighting our ages. The fact that I was in your tutorial last century is confronting to me, and I hope to you. I also acknowledge that I am a visitor on these lands this evening. I was deeply moved by that very generous welcome to country, and I acknowledge the elders, past and present, and the First Nations people who are part of this gathering tonight. I am honoured to be with you. I also want to thank Belinda and this community here at Canberra Baptist for your very generous hospitality. I know how much work it takes to make this look as effortless as this evening does. Like the duck paddling underneath the still, smooth water. I see what you do and I thank you for it. And I also, before we really begin, want to acknowledge all of you who are gathered in this room and acknowledge the profound depth of emotion that I know these circumstances bring for many of you. I recognise that some of you experience a deep grief that this gathering has been rendered necessary, a profound sense of loss that the group of churches, the association of which you have been a part and which you have served, in some cases for many decades, no longer welcomes you as it once did. And I acknowledge the sadness that is attached to that for some of you. I know some of you have moved from that to a posture of pragmatism. There are things that need to be done and questions that need to be answered, and we might as well get on with it. And I know that there are also people here for whom the promise of a new thing, the new possibilities, are quite energising and exciting. And none of these different responses is, I think, more appropriate than any other, but many a church group, has come unstuck by failing to recognise the varying experiences of those in the room. And so I want to say, I see you and I recognise it. Perhaps look to the person next to you and recognise that this experience is for them perhaps a little different from the one you're having. I want to send my greetings to those joining us online this evening. I know that there are people who wish they could be here and who wish you all the very best. I think there are also some online who do not necessarily wish us the best, but to everyone, I say welcome and peace be with you. We meet tonight in faith. That is my posture. Faith in the one who lives in dark places and transforms difficult circumstances, and who reveals life as an irrepressible force, even when what is good and right seems to be dead and buried. And for that, I am very, very grateful. And so, I have been asked to speak about being Baptist. I'm aware I am not the only person in the room for whom this is an area of interest. And without making assumptions about the age of anyone present, it is possible some of you have been thinking about this even longer than I have. What I offer this evening, I hope, is not so much expertise as some catalyst for conversation, for questioning, with some genuine grappling about the past and present and future of the 400-year-old movement that we call Baptist. Obviously, for me, talking about this, thinking about it, teaching on it is my vocation. I have the privilege of doing this at Whitley College. But my interest is more than professional. Perhaps like you, I have spent most of my life in Baptist communities. It is where I learned to engage with the scriptures. It is where I learned that God loved me. It's where I learned that I had decisions to make about what kind of person I was going to be in the world. It's where I was taken seriously as a young person, where I was acknowledged as having gifts and where they were celebrated, where I received the gift of faith. It's where I sing and where I love and where I learn and where I grow. Perhaps the Baptist movement has been some of that for you too. And I say all of that to make it clear that when we talk about being Baptist, I have skin in the game, just like you do. This is not a detached historical or intellectual curiosity. not a set of abstract principles, not a doctrinal statement that I do or do not sign, and also not something I can give up on easily. So Nathan has spoken a little about the specific circumstances that may have led us to be gathered here tonight. I'm also interested in what is happening or has been happening in society more broadly that informs our reflections tonight. I actually think we live in a really fascinating cultural moment where there is a surge of interest in questions of identity generally. Who are we? What are our political and national and ethnic identities, our religious identities? What do we make of identities expressed through sexual orientation, through gender conformity or non-conformity? What is the role that Indigenous identities play or ought to play in the political landscape? And at times, the vexed issues of how these different identities relate to one another. So these are live questions, aren't they, in our time and place far beyond the walls of the church. People are struggling to respond to them, and this creates a significant amount of anxiety in individuals, certainly, but particularly in institutions where people are keen to maintain stability and clarity. So this evening, as I grapple a little and help you grapple, I hope, with some of the questions that emerge around what it means to have a Baptist identity, it's a question that we're asking not just in isolation from the broader society, but a question that we're asking in this cultural moment. What does it look like to be intentionally and faithfully Baptist Christians in Canberra and in Sydney and in Newcastle and in Melbourne and beyond in the year 2023? And how might we engage with 400 years of Baptist history and 2,000 years of Christian history while being aware, in the midst of that we live in a society that is increasingly secular and largely post-denominational, and yet somehow at the same time also increasingly tribal and polarised? I have set up a set of questions that are, I hope you recognise, impossible to answer. I'm glad that we have a weekend. For quite a long time now, sociologists, perhaps beginning with someone like Anthony Giddens, have reflected on the way that identity itself has become more dynamic in our society. With the movement of people around the world, the diversity of religious and political views to which we have such easy access, with individual autonomy being prioritised, people are aware there's a range of choices they can make about who they're going to be, about how they might live. It seems to me that within the church, this has caused particular anxiety. While lots of people experience all of that as freedom, it doesn't necessarily bring stability in the institutions that people are hoping to maintain. Baptists have certainly been amongst those who have seemed very concerned about this destabilising sense in the world, and, as humans do, have responded in a range of ways, both helpful and less so. Interestingly, it seems to me that Baptists, perhaps as much or more than most, have actually been aware of, cognizant of, the dynamism of identity for our entire history. After all, the conviction that a person ought to be baptised as an adult, as a believer rather than as an infant, proceeds from an awareness that the decision to profess faith in Christ is one made freely, a chosen identity, not a static given. We are aware of this history and try and live into it without being enslaved by it. So I want to think about the Baptist story in all its complexity. And I have to confess that I am less interested than perhaps my friend Nathan is in the competition around who is more Baptist or who is better at being Baptist, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I actually believe the Christian life is at its essence profoundly anti-competitive. There is nothing to win here, it's been given. If the first are last, it's not clear to me what winning that or any context would provide. But secondly, because if we are to be honest with our history and with each other, the idea of being Baptist is inconveniently slippery. As I think about this, I want to acknowledge that I am very indebted to the work of Curtis Freeman. Many of you would be aware of him, who works out of Duke University. And his work on framing Baptist identity in recent years has been incredibly helpful to me. And he asks a basic but very difficult to answer question. Can we tell the Baptist story in a way that all Baptists would recognise as their own? Does anyone want to give a yes or a no? Perhaps we could compare numbers at the beginning and then the end of the weekend. He gives a very beautiful and thoughtful and fulsome set of reflections on why the project of pinning down Baptist identity is so vexed. But tonight I want to borrow 4 of his observations and just muse on them a little with you. And I don't talk about it being slippery to throw up my hands in the air and suggest that this whole conversation is futile. Not at all. In fact, I really am hoping to do the opposite. Because in exploring why it's so difficult to pin down this idea of being Baptist and to name the practices and the distinctives in a way we can all recognise, I really hope to actually celebrate the richness and the diversity in the story that makes simple explanations difficult. To name the tensions and to suggest, as Nathan has already done so well, that it's possible that this complexity and nuance is actually the road ahead rather than a problem to be managed, that it is actually our way forward rather than the cause of anxiety and schism and obsessive practices of boundary maintenance. So, tonight I want to borrow 4 of Curtis Freeman's observations. I'm going to name them now and then test you. Not really. Firstly, that Baptist identity is contested. Secondly, that Baptist identity is convictional. Thirdly, that it is contextual. And fourthly, that it is communal. So I imagine that you know, as I know, that what being Baptist really is contested. We have not found, and we will not find, precise agreement on this. It is because our history has been inclusive, it has taken place across continents and eras incredibly dissimilar from one another. Of course, we look to the story of brave dissenters who stood apart from the Church of England, risking life and livelihood by advocating for this vision of church, which one did not belong to by default, but by free choice, marked by baptism. Of course, that story is at our beginning. If you look for the story of those who wrote tracts about freedom of religion and liberty of conscience and the rightful place of dissent, you will find them, and they're fiery and fantastic. If you look for those who demanded the separation of church and state, separation of believers from the monarchy and all its power and privilege, you will find it. It's there. Also, if you look for the hellfire and brimstone preaching of 18th century revivalism, you will find it. In fact, you might even be tempted to suggest, as some have, that the 16th century English separatists called Baptists would have faded into obscurity, like lots of other separatists did, without the evangelicalism of the Great Awakenings. And if you look for conservatism and biblicism and a fairly narrow set of requirements for belonging, you will find them. It's a rich and diverse story that can inspire us, or that almost any different group can lay claim to. So perhaps this is all the more reason why Baptists need to learn to live with the diversity inherent in our own story. Perhaps in recent years you have watched, as millions of people have, the TV show Who Do You Think You Are? It was a surprise hit. It started on the BBC, it came to Australia, it went to the US. And typically a person, maybe a celebrity, meets with historians and archivists and goes through their history. They discover the controversies, the scandals, the relatives they didn't know they had, and inevitably come to a point of realisation. This explains some of who we are. I draw a line now between this unknown reality of a past time and some of the lived reality of today. I think we do a little bit of that in this project. So with this contested past and with our inclination to reject established church structures and practices at the time of our origin stories, Baptists in general have balked at the suggestion that we have a tradition or a history. I know this because these students come to my class. Tradition is quickly dismissed as what the other guys do. Maintaining human structures and rituals as a distraction or a dilution of the purity of the biblical witness. But those same students seemed to change course a little when I introduced them to Alistair McIntyre on tradition, whose definition I have found so helpful. He writes of tradition as arguments extended through time. Baptist life, anyone? A living tradition, he suggests, is a historically extended, socially embodied argument, an argument precisely, in part, about which goods constitute the tradition. So, in contrast to those who find diversity of belief and practice and anxiety-inducing problematic, he suggests, and I want to leapfrog a little on him, that perhaps the very vitality that a declining church might be so desperately longing for lies in our ability to have this contested conversation over time. Dissent is, at least in part, the tradition. For 400 years, we've been trying to work it out. As those very loved traditional Baptist words say, there is still more light and truth to break forth from the word. It's not done. It's not finished. We're not propping up something from the past. We are taking its riches and examples into our future. So acknowledging that Baptist identity is contested opens us up to great vitality, I think. But we will fail at this project if we do not make room for and name the anxiety it also brings. Because the question that many of our friends who are not gathered with us tonight are asking is, sure, but how does one maintain and grow and monitor and protect such a thing? In an era of 30-second sound bites and the desire for pithy one-sentence mission statements, it's all inconveniently complex. I think because of this, people all along the theological spectrum are tempted at times to speak in absolutes about who we are and where we are from. But I am suggesting and inviting you to resist the temptation. People's lives and their lives of faith are complex and nuanced, and the church that welcomes them genuinely will need to be complex and nuanced as well. So this brings me on to Curtis Freeman's second observation, that Baptist identity is convictional. As I'm sure you are aware, the Baptists who emerged in the 16th and 17th century were self-consciously non-creedal people, as those who had seen the ways in which the creeds had been used as instruments of control and domination, enforcing conformity, punishing questioning, often at the hands of the state or the state church. Baptists have typically rejected creedalism. Those who are troubled by this, and there are many, immediately protest that this indicates some lack of conviction, something wishy-washy, without substance, without committed doctrines and practices, which is not the truth. And nowhere is this seen more clearly than in the early Baptists' enthusiasm, and I mean enthusiasm, for producing confessions of faith. They loved them. Perhaps another way of saying Baptist identity is convictional is to say that it is often confessional. The early Baptists loved writing statements about what they believed and how they practiced and why. So how is this different from creedalism, we may ask? It's an important question. Baptist confessions of faith have typically expressed the way in which a local group of worshipping people in a particular place and a particular time were working out their faith in the company of one another, interpreting the scriptures together, discerning the wisdom of God together. They are identified, usually in the very first sentence, by the place and the date on which they were written, and they are signed by those who are involved in articulating the faith as they saw it. They are expressive of the faith people had and the faith they practiced, rather than existing as a demand that others do the same. The expectation is that they are dynamic and contextual, that they are living documents. How do I know this? Well, I know this from the very first confessions of faith. I don't know if any of you have studied John Smith's first confessions any time recently. His first one is in 1609, a short confession of faith in 20 articles. It is profoundly convictional about the nature of God and the problem of sin and the person of Christ and the rituals of baptism and communion and the role they play in the church, the role of good works and church authority and leadership and the prospect of life everlasting. He describes the convictions upon which that community of faith was formed. He expresses their life together in the strongest, most convictional terms. So how do we know that it was intended as a dynamic expression of faith, not to be enforced on others? Well, one of the ways we know is that less than 2 years later, he and his community wrote another one, a different one. The 20 articles have become 100. Don't tell me Baptist life isn't vital and exciting. This is a historian's dream. Can you imagine? You put them side by side and you can almost hear the debates taking place. You can almost see the conversations that happened to get from 1609 to 1611. You'll notice that the 1611 one has Bible verses next to every single section. You can be sure someone made that note, that was important. Unlike a creed which stands static and is used to determine who is orthodox and who is not, a confession comes from within the life of the community and expresses how they believe and live in the here and now. It is an act of witness to what is, not a demand for what must be. And these are profoundly different. Now, be clear that most of the early Baptists, and in fact most Baptists throughout time, would be pretty untroubled by the content of the creeds. They believed those things. Their invitation was that people come to their convictions freely and then express them. And then express them again, the same or differently, as more light and truth break forth. So that leads rather beautifully into the third reflection, which is, of course, that Baptist identity is contextual. That the confession of faith one can write in 1609 is not the same confession of faith one writes 2 years later. It's not the same in England as it is in Amsterdam, and 400 years later, it is not the same in Canberra as it was in any of those places. The early Baptists were learning and growing and responding. They were living in a particular place and time as a worshipping community, constantly asking questions about what it looks like to be faithful then and there. And so for us, as fascinated as I may be by the history, we don't aim to repeat it. We are not blind recipients of a tradition or stewards of a heritage which we are forced to slavishly replicate. But we receive those things as gifts with gratitude and then ask, who are we? Where is Christ in our midst? How do we express our convictions in this time and place? How do we worship? How do we invite people into covenant relationships with God and with each other? What does fullness of life look like here and now for us, for you, for those who are young, for those who are old, who are gay, who are straight, who are Indigenous, who are refugees? What are we learning from the conversation between the church and the world, between the scriptures and our experience, between the faith of other times and places and our faith in this time and place? At the heart of Baptist life has always been local worshipping communities. And I have to say, it is completely unsurprising, is it not, that they do not look the same? This must surely be the most unsurprising aspect of a church tradition. And to complicate things further, or let's say to enrich things further, shall we? Baptist identity is not only contextual and contested and convictional, it is, of course, at its very heart and core, communal. There is no solo Baptist. It's an oxymoron. In rejecting a top-down, centralised model of authority and decision-making in the church, the early Baptists organised themselves markedly differently from the established churches of the time. And it proceeds from that utterly audacious conviction that I still hold that every member of the church, every believer, every part of the body could be part of discerning the wisdom of God. Baptist churches worked things out together. They worked things out together as they worshipped together, as they interpreted scripture together. They made decisions together. They confessed their faith together as they understood it in their context. There are lists of people who sign the bottoms of these confessions of faith. Women and men, older people and younger people. That this beautifully optimistic vision of the church produces tensions is utterly unsurprising. As Nathan raised earlier, and is certainly at the forefront of our minds, the tension has perhaps been most apparent, not just now, but over time, in this dance we have between local autonomy and association. Baptists worship as free, local communities of faith who covenant to worship and make decisions together. But for a long time, from the earliest times, it has been recognised that just as the relationships within the community reflect the life of the Trinity and are our calling, so the relationships between churches, the business of associating with one another, has been seen as an opportunity for love and growth and relationship and cooperation. It has also been the site of things most unlike those I have just named. Often, Baptists, who are known as delightfully pragmatic people, have put up with association in order to get things done. Mission, social action, evangelism, training pastors. The more complicated the regulatory and other environments get, the more this becomes apparent. Getting together in this way, associating in this way, has never been on the basis of uniformity. At its best, it's been in recognition of the New Testament metaphors for the church, which are most often relational and dynamic, like bodies that move with parts that work together, or vines that grow with branches stretching out, producing fruit, or households with many members. The key conviction of Baptist life has been relationship, but this doesn't mean that it's unproblematic. And perhaps its importance, its centrality, is exactly what undoes us. At times it's been a dance, sometimes it's been a debate, sometimes it's a tradition defined as an argument held through time, perhaps a long time, and sometimes it has fractured. I do not believe that the fracturing of our associations or of the church as a whole is God's design or hope. And I don't believe it's inevitable. Every era has produced its controversies and disagreements, and if we schismed at each disagreement, we would all end up sitting alone in the corner. It's neither life-giving to those in the church, and it is certainly not an edifying witness to those beyond it. But hear this. The wonderful theologian Elizabeth Johnson many years ago taught me, as a young dissenter as I was then, negatives alone do not nourish. Negatives are the great temptation of a dissenting movement. Negatives are the dissenter's dilemma, the separatist's temptation. There are many moments like this in the Baptist story where a group of faithful people needs to decide if they are going to be against things or if they are going to do the much harder work of deciding who they are and what their convictions might be rather than what they are not. Baptists have existed with a very determined sense of hope. A sometimes relentless, actually, future orientation that lends itself to a kind of historical amnesia that I find in my classroom teaching on this. People who know a great deal about Jesus and Paul and now. That's its worst, but at its best is the refusal to give in to the temptation to lower our eyes to the apparently limited horizon of this difficult day, instead insisting via some wholly improbable kind of hope that there is a righteous vision of what might be and a future for the church that does not flatten out our difference, our richness, or even our contests and our arguments. This is the kind of discussion I'm most interested in. What is our confession of the faith in this time and place? I can't express yours. Only you can do that. Ideally, you can do it together. Maybe it includes some things like this: a vision of the church which radically welcomes people both like and unlike us. A church which resists the call to tend to and maintain its boundaries and instead proclaims a life and love that is generous and extravagant and hopeful, which is radically unafraid of diversity and questioning, which doesn't seek to impose uniformity, but which really, truly trusts that there is still more light and truth to break forth from the Word of God, which holds the Scriptures to be central and authoritative but doesn't weaponise them, which shows the joy and enthusiasm for expressing faith and conviction, but which expresses rather than imposes those convictions. A church which worships together and eats together and grieves together and contests ideas together because we don't own the story. We live in it. So I began tonight talking about the range of emotions that I know is in this room, and I want to return there as I close. I think in times where we perceive things to be unstable, there is a strong instinct to want to simplify everything, to bed it down. We do it with belief systems, with the contours of community life. We do it by enforcing norms of behaviour and belief, by quashing innovation, by disallowing questioning, and also by managing our and others' emotions. I have reminded you tonight of what you already know, that Baptist life is complex and contested, and it always has been, that tensions abound and they are not going anywhere. But I believe, and I believe our history reveals this to be true, that it is possible to hold on to these apparently opposing emotions at the one time. And so I am here disappointed and yet hopeful, betrayed and yet loyal, filled with grief and filled with gratitude, mindful of the past and oriented toward the future, committed as ever to being Baptist, and yet open to what may come, wanting to learn more about how to express my faith and convictions with fervour without imposing it on anyone. Thanks be to God. Amen.